I'm a lawyer, so depending on who I'm asked for assistance by, it may be the police, it may be social welfare. It's often the victim themselves. Often I will be asked by a friend of the victim, and she will be overseas, and she's not even aware that we're taking steps and going to court and getting orders to get her back. And she's not aware that all that's been done until she's produced at the British Embassy or High Commission and told. But my job as a lawyer is to try and get orders and ensure that they're enforced and complied with. The first case I became involved with over 15 years ago was a case which set out the law in this country for forced marriages for the first time. And that involved a Sikh girl of 15 years who had disappeared. And her elder sister was looking for her. Her elder sister having left the family because her parents didn't approve of the relationship she'd formed at university. She was being told in the community, oh, your sister's been sent to boarding school somewhere in the north of England, which she clearly didn't believe. She believed the child was in India and that there was a marriage planned. Initially, because there was no law and there was no precedent, the courts were reluctant to look at the case and understand why she as a sister was bringing this case before the court and asking for help. But eventually, the High Court ordered her parents to identify where her sister was and to produce her sister in Delhi. And when her sister was eventually produced, because her parents were very reluctant initially, it transpired she was indeed held there against her will. She'd been there for 6 months, and the wedding was going to take place in the next 3 weeks. So she was returned to this country with a seminal judgment that said, even if parents are acting within their parental authority to arrange a marriage for their child, if their child does not want that marriage, that child, although not an adult, can oppose it, and the law will protect the child to do that. So that was in 1997. It was called KR. The issue of honour-based abuse, if it's against a child, or unforced marriages, is a specific form of abuse, but it is a form that has its own generic basis. So within that household, that's happening, there may be what you may call normal forms of child abuse, i.e. over-disciplining a child for not doing homework. But that's different than the formalised, almost, abuse that is inherent in forced marriages. So it is a distinct form of abuse that has its own self-perpetuating basis. But it is not the same as familiar child abuse that may occur at random across any number of different types of families, ranging from emotional abuse to child neglect. But it's almost, it's a form of abuse that forms a code, and when it happens, you could look at 2 or 3 different families, and there would be at least 70% of it would be consistent threads of behaviour in each of those families. And that's why it's a different form of abuse. In all forced marriage cases, there will be issues of neglect in the sense of not reinforcing self-worth in children and not encouraging their education because they don't need it. All cases will have the denial of self-determination in children. So children aren't taught at all, ever, within the family context, to make their own decisions. Whereas all good childcare manuals will say that's a good thing for children. You teach children how to make choices. Good choices, bad choices, but make choices. So that just doesn't come into their social and development or in the parental role. Very patriarchal, that father, brothers first. Very patriarchal. And the code of conduct that young female has to carry with her. So she is aware from a very young age that everything she does outside of the home reflects back on her family. Not just in terms of, well, don't get in trouble with the police or whatever, try and behave at school, but wider than that, how she dresses, how she looks, who she mixes with, all of that she carries for her family, as does her mother. And it's that, so she is the keeper of the code. And so you then get this symbiotic relationship where she will conform against things that she doesn't want to, but her code tells her she has to. So it's all quite complex. I don't think that forced marriage, certainly the British experience, is based on a commercialised concept, but the families that practice it have in their minds the decision of which family their child should marry into. Now that may be because it's a good family, it may be because it is normally part of their family, and it may be, often it will be to keep the family together, which will mean that if there's land back home and they're from the same village, that's all kept together. So the monetary issues involved are not huge, but it's still ensuring that the families that are within the village and own the land still intermarry and still retain that ownership. And that seems to me to be the driving force. So it's not the person back home they want her to marry could be, it would be unusual, but you could say he could be a very good medical doctor. Well, it would have to be that specific medical doctor, though. They wouldn't want another medical doctor, equally handsome, equally qualified, equally rich. It has to be that one, from that family, from that caste, of that surname. It has to be him and not anybody else. So the reasons for choice, the parental choice of the groom, is something cultural and something will appertain to their family, but they're very firm, set reasons. What you do see, and I have seen often, is a dispute within the family as to which of two cousins she should marry. So it's not whether she should be forced into a marriage, it's just which marriage. And you will see the family split, and that often happens. So if the maternal side saying it should be X and trying to stop the other marriage, and the paternal side trying to stop that marriage, but it's not actually about whether this girl should have a marriage, because she's going to have a marriage, they're fighting about which one. There is a very real problem in this country, and I anticipate in other European states, about young people throughout their lives having extended holidays overseas. When they're younger children, I mean, there are issues about education, but there are not concerns about what is the purpose. But what happens generally as a pattern is a young female normally will get to about 15, coming up to 16, no interest in her obtaining exams, because it's known in the family she doesn't need her exams because she's not going to work, she's going to be married. I think that sometimes she is removed early in order to ensure she's removed at a time she's not going to kick against it. So she's more malleable, they'll be able to persuade her to go. But the pattern tends to be withdrawn from school and with no real explanation other than saying, well, she's been having an extended holiday in wherever it is, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and she's with her family. And for many years there was a lack of will, probably on behalf of educational authorities, to follow that up. That's now, I hope, being changed, and that they are now, if a young female is taken off the register, even with an explanation and a request for permission, that it's not just accepted at face value, that there are questions made. Well, why? Why is it appropriate to remove her middle of her school year? Why isn't she doing her GCSEs? Why isn't she coming back for college? And hopefully, and ideally, having her interviewed in that country by a British official. I think what needs to be done, in a way, is to keep doing what we're doing year in, year out, in the hope that eventually, as we move into another generation, the message has got through and you're dealing with different types of parents. What also needs to be done is not a breakup of the communities, but you've got to get into those communities which are all very self-sufficient and self-serving. And it's very hard to get information in and very hard to get information out. And I think young people who are within those communities feel that they are unable to access the outside world without difficulty. So one thing perpetuates the other. So we've got to try and break that cycle somehow. Well, within any of the main religions and communities and cultures, there are bodies and there are people who share similar values to me, and who will in fact come to me with cases and say, I can't be identified, but this is happening to that young person, and can you help? It's rare that one comes across an absolute person who will absolutely say, this, what we are doing is correct, and it is you that is wrong, and it is not for you to tell us how to run our culture or how to deal with our young people. It's very rare that somebody will stand up and actually say it. Often you will get somebody paying lip service to, yes, yes, we think it's a wonderful law and we do not condone such practices. But when you ask them, well, what are you doing then to stop it? There's actually very little coming forward as to what they're actively prepared to do. Often what will happen when a situation comes to light is that the family will call upon perhaps somebody within the community elders or somebody to try and mediate it. They will say, mediate, reconcile our family, talk to our young person. Now, there are two agendas there going on. The family probably genuinely wish to make themselves understood with their child and to resolve the situation within the family. But the community elder may have their own specific agenda, which has to do with protecting the integrity of the community. So they want to mediate and need to mediate that situation so that it doesn't end up in the newspapers or before a court or in a reported judgment. So my concern is that there are, there's not just one set of motivations and not just one agenda that's happening in those situations. I would anticipate that most people within what are called the communities, for want of a better word, they want to protect their image. They want to not to be the person or the community with the finger pointed at for human rights breaches. And that's a fairly basic human desire and a political desire, perhaps, in some situations. And that is why I think the community elders and the community leaders wish to take control of the situations and to resolve it in their way, as they put it. We can resolve this in our way. And I'll say, well, if it doesn't result in that young person coming back, because that's what they want to do, then thank you, we'll resolve it in our way. The practice of forced marriage and HBV and other issues that surround it, they're not restricted to a religion, but they are part of culture. So they are prevalent within cultures. So, for example, a lot of cases come from the Punjab. Now that might be Sikhs in the Punjab, maybe Muslims in the Punjab, but it's the Punjabi culture, not the religion as such, that's the lead. I mean, in the UK we're seeing other communities that previously we hadn't, say 10 years ago, because we have new communities. So now we're seeing a lot more Kurdish cases because of the Iraqi conflict. We're seeing a lot more Afghani cases because we have larger communities from those countries now. So it's cultural, in my view, not religious. I've had a number of mothers who've come to seek assistance for their, usually daughters. But that's, I have to say, usually where either the mother is actually British, white British, so it's been a mixed marriage, which has broken down, or she is first generation British born, and it was her husband, she may have had a forced marriage herself, her husband had joined her. There are cases where the prime motivator is the mother. There are a number of cases where a widowed mother will be the prime motivator in having her daughter marry somebody from back home. And then there are a significant number of cases where it's very clear that the mother's got absolutely no control over the situation at all, and anything she says is of no consequence. And she's in a very, very difficult situation. And often the child will go through with a marriage specifically to protect the mother, specifically to ensure that the mother doesn't get another beating or whatever. Most forced marriages have an element of violence. Sometimes it's not actual violence, but it's the threat. But it's a threat which has teeth, as it were. The person knows when they say, you know, I will be beaten. She means, I will be beaten as I saw my sister beaten, or as I saw my cousin beaten. And often these young people say, my family said they would kill me. And that's the height of the evidence. And in most situations, people say, oh, well, that was just an off-the-cuff comment. It wasn't meant that somebody's going to actually murder you. But she will know, because she will have been told over the years of whether it happened back home, or of cases where when somebody was told they would be killed if they didn't do X, Y, Z, they were in fact killed. So the threat is sometimes all that's necessary. But then there are other cases where there is very, very real and severe violence, or where young people are kept in a house, say abroad, where there are 2 guards at the door with shotguns, where she is shown the gun and said, well, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, this is what will happen. So we do a lot of young girls who come back and were shown the Kalashnikov and told that's what would happen. It's difficult to know what class of parent or family. But it's certainly not only restricted to the poorer classes. But what I see and what I come across is it's still happening, but it's a different type of force and it's a different type of pressure. So in the more educated families, the emotional pressure is of a different type than in the other cases. So there is no violence as such, or very real violence, or real threats of violence, but huge, huge amounts of emotional pressure that young person, even if they've gone off to university, feel they can't withstand. That if they don't, their family have put them through medical school, and how can I say no? And this real creating in them the inability to express their own views. So I think it happens, but it happens by a different means.